A millionaire cruelly kicked the pregnant maid out of the mansion. "Leave here now, you and your child." But what happened next shocked everyone. Daniel Harrison wrapped up another grueling day of work. The cold gleam of the building's lights reflected off the polished wood of his desk, where contracts and reports piled up. For him, every number, every negotiation, and every decision were critical pieces in a power game that left no room for mistakes. Daniel wasn't just a millionaire, he was an empire on 2 feet. The surname Harrison carried a weight that few dared to challenge. From a young age, he had been groomed to be ruthless. His father, George Harrison, a strict and cruel man, had taught him that weakness was a luxury the family couldn't afford. Success didn't come from sentimental ties, but from firm decisions and an iron fist. Daniel had learned that lesson well. In contrast to him, Nicholas, his younger brother, seemed to have inherited only the softer traits of the family. Sensitive, idealistic, and a dreamer, he never fit into the business world of the Harrisons. He preferred books over meetings, art over investments, and above all, he believed that money shouldn't be the center of anyone's life. For Daniel, that was an unacceptable folly. Still, deep down, though he'd never admit it, there was a faint admiration for the ease with which Nicholas saw the world. As Daniel reviewed a spreadsheet, the distant echoes of feminine laughter floated from the staff quarters. He didn't pay attention. To him, the household staff were invisible, just necessary cogs to keep the house running. Among these cogs was Natalie. Natalie had worked in the Harrison mansion for years, moving like a shadow through the hallways. Always discreet, efficient, and quiet, she had never given Daniel a reason to notice her presence. But now, she carried a secret that was impossible to hide. She had discovered she was pregnant weeks before. When the first dizzy spells and nausea hit, she tried to deny the truth to herself. But as the days passed, and her belly began to show a gentle curve, fear took root in her chest. Working for Daniel Harrison had always been difficult. Surviving under his critical, relentless gaze while pregnant seemed impossible. Every day became a game of deception. She chose loose clothes, avoided staying in the same room as Daniel for too long, and worked doubly hard to avoid raising suspicions. But fate has cruel ways of revealing secrets. Patricia Harrison, the family matriarch, had a trained eye for details that others missed. With her graying hair always neatly tied in a bun, she carried herself with a regal air and a sharp mind. Unlike Daniel, she had never seen the staff as mere subordinates. Observant, she had noticed that Natalie was acting differently, more reserved, touching her belly when she thought no one was looking. That afternoon, as Patricia passed by the garden, she saw Natalie standing by the fountain, her eyes cast down, hands resting gently on her belly in a way that brooked no doubt. A chill ran through her. Natalie was expecting a child. The confirmation came a few hours later in the worst possible way. Susan, the house's most gossiping cook, had suspected something for some time. When Natalie refused to try a sweet treat that made her nauseous, Susan wasted no time in spreading the news like wildfire. Within minutes, the rumor had reached Patricia's ears. Without wasting any time, Patricia sought out Natalie, finding her in the mansion's small laundry room. The young woman froze when she saw the matriarch standing at the door, her gaze firm. "Is it true?" Patricia asked bluntly. Natalie froze. Denying it was useless. Tears filled her eyes before she finally whispered, "Yes, Mom." Patricia's heart tightened. The Harrison mansion was already a difficult place for any employee, but for a pregnant woman it was a nightmare. "How many months along are you?" "Almost 5. Patricia closed her eyes for a moment. Natalie had been there long enough for Patricia to know that the young woman wasn't irresponsible, but the question hanging in the air was unavoidable. "Does the father know?" Natalie looked away. "I can't say." The answer was enough for Patricia to understand that the matter was delicate, but she also knew that in a house like that, secrets never stayed hidden for long. And indeed, they didn't. At dinner that night, the truth finally came to light. The table was large, decorated with fine silverware and expensive wines. Daniel cut his steak with precision when, in the middle of the conversation, he noticed Natalie serving a plate to Patricia. His sharp eyes noticed the subtle swelling around the maid's waist. The fork paused in mid-air. The silence that followed was nearly palpable. "Natalie," Daniel's voice cut through the room like a blade. The young woman froze. He rarely spoke to the staff, and when he did, it was never good. "Are you pregnant?" Shock rippled through the table. Patricia looked at Natalie, who lowered her head. "Yes, sir." Daniel's eyes narrowed, his face turning into a mask of contained fury. "Who is the father?" Natalie clenched her hands, her heart racing. She couldn't say. Not there, not like this. It doesn't matter. The answer was a mistake. Daniel abruptly stood, pushing his chair back. "It does matter. You're carrying a child in this house and think you can hide it from me?" The air seemed to thicken. Patricia gripped her glass tightly while Nicholas turned his gaze away, tense. I can't say," Natalie stammered. Daniel's expression hardened even more. He didn't tolerate challenges, least of all from a maid. "Leave," he said coldly. Natalie's eyes widened. "Sir? Pack your things and leave this house. You and that child have no place here anymore." A deadly silence filled the room. Patricia stared at Daniel, incredulous. Nicholas stood frozen, unable to react. Natalie felt her legs go weak. The place where she had lived and worked for years now cruelly rejected her. Daniel's decision fell on Natalie like a cruel, definitive blow. The silence that followed his expulsion order was more deafening than any shout. With trembling legs and a racing heart, she knew there was no room for discussion. She hadn't expected compassion from Daniel, but there was one last hope, one last look she desperately sought. Nicholas. He was there, sitting at the table, his head down, his fists clenched on his knees. He didn't say a word. The betrayal of silence was worse than the humiliation of being thrown out. Without any choice, Natalie climbed up to the small room she had in the staff quarters. Her suitcase, always kept at the back of the closet, now seemed like an impossible weight to carry. With trembling hands, she began folding her clothes, fighting back the tears that threatened to blind her. The baby in her belly moved gently, as if it too could feel her pain. She heard footsteps approaching and, for a brief moment, thought that Nicholas was coming to find her, that he would say something, anything, to stop this. But it was Patricia. The matriarch stopped at the door, her eyes filled with concern. "Child," Patricia whispered, but Natalie shook her head. "I can't stay," she replied, her voice choked. "Not like this." Patricia closed her eyes for a moment. The weight of the situation was unbearable, but she knew that arguing with Daniel at that moment was pointless. What could she do? What was really within her power? Natalie grabbed the handle of the suitcase and took a deep breath before heading downstairs. The weight of each step felt like a sentence. As she passed through the grand hall of the mansion, all the staff went silent. Susan, the gossiping cook, peeked from the kitchen, satisfied that she had fueled the scandal. Others merely looked away, powerless in the face of Daniel Harrison's authority. And then the rain came. As soon as she stepped outside, a storm broke. The cold drops clung to her dress, and her hair was soaked within seconds. Natalie stopped for a moment, gripping the suitcase handle tightly. She wanted to look back. She wanted to believe that someone, anyone, would call her back. But no one did. With hesitant steps, she walked to the iron gate and, with a broken soul, disappeared into the night. Inside the mansion, Patricia turned to her youngest son. "What have you done?" Her voice was a whisper, filled with indignation. Nicholas remained still, his eyes fixed on his untouched plate. "Look at me!" Patricia demanded, her patience running out. Slowly, Nicholas lifted his face. "I couldn't say anything, Mom." His voice was weak. "You know how he is." But Patricia already knew. Even before hearing the confession, she knew. "The baby is yours, isn't it?" Nicholas swallowed hard. The words seemed stuck in his throat, but in the end, he merely nodded. Patricia's heart clenched. It wasn't a surprise, but it was devastating to hear the confirmation. Natalie had been unjustly expelled, humiliated, and abandoned, all for a child of the Harrisons. Without saying another word, she went to Daniel's office. He was standing by the large glass bookshelf, pouring himself a glass of whiskey, as if what had just happened was merely a trivial detail. "You just threw your own nephew out of this house." The phrase hung in the air like an irrefutable accusation. Daniel paused, his fingers tightening around the glass. "What?" "The baby. He's Nicholas's." Daniel's expression darkened. He slowly turned to face his mother, his face hard as stone. "He dishonored this family." Patricia stepped forward, furious. "Don't you dare! Dishonor! You speak like your father, Daniel, as if this baby is a mistake, as if Natalie is garbage." Daniel took a sip of the whiskey, his eyes focused on an invisible point in front of him. He brought her into this house, got involved with her, and now he lets her leave without taking responsibility. That's weakness. "Weakness?" Patricia laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. "You're so blinded by your pride that you can't see the monstrosity you just committed." "I did what was necessary." Patricia shook her head. "No, Daniel, you did what your father would do." That phrase hit him, but he didn't respond. The next morning, Nicholas went to the mansion's gate. He had only left his room after everyone had already gone to bed. The night had been long, filled with regret and fear. He wanted to go after Natalie, but he hesitated. The truth was, he knew what he would face if he made that decision. And Daniel confirmed his worst fears when he appeared behind him. "Don't even think about it." Nicholas turned, his heart racing. "I need to go after her, Daniel." Daniel's older brother narrowed his eyes. "If you go, forget that you're a Harrison." Nicholas felt the world spin. You would disown me." Daniel approached, each step heavy with threat. "If you cross that gate for that woman, don't ever come back." Nicholas swallowed hard. He wasn't strong enough. He wasn't like Natalie. He wasn't like Patricia. And so, cowardly, he stayed where he was. Far away, Natalie curled up in the small one-room apartment she had managed to rent. The walls were peeling, the bed barely fit in the space. But here, at least, she wasn't invisible. If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're enjoying it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. The rain was battering the city with fury that night. Outside the small apartment where Natalie lived, thunder echoed through the dark sky, while gusts of wind made the windows tremble. Inside the cramped, poorly lit room, she tried to find a comfortable position on the narrow bed. But the discomfort she had been feeling for hours was starting to turn into something more intense. A sharp pain pierced her belly, pulling a strangled groan from her. She breathed deeply, trying to convince herself it wasn't serious, that it was probably just a passing contraction. But when the pain came again, stronger, deeper, she knew. The baby was coming. Panic set in. She still had a few weeks to go before the birth. It couldn't be now. Not like this. Natalie tried to get up, but her legs gave out. Her fingertips dug into the mattress as another contraction forced her to bend over in pain. Sweat dripped down her forehead, mixing with tears she hadn't realized were falling. She needed help. Fumbling blindly for the phone, she dialed Patricia's number with difficulty. Each beep seemed like an eternity. When the matriarch's voice came through on the other end, firm but filled with concern, Natalie clung to that sound like it was her only salvation. "Patricia," her voice came out between sobs, almost a whisper. "It's the baby. He's coming." On the other end of the line, Patricia fell silent for a moment, taking in the weight of those words. Then her voice came back, steady. "Hang in there, dear. I'm coming right now." Patricia hung up and leapt to her feet. Her heart was racing, her hands trembling as she grabbed the car keys. The storm raged outside, but nothing would stop her from getting to Natalie. In the mansion's hallway, Nicholas saw her rush out and frowned. "Mom, what happened?" Patricia hesitated. "It's Natalie. The baby. He's being born." Nicholas's face paled, his stomach twisted with a mix of guilt and fear. For the past few months, he had spent his nights tormented by regret, wondering what might have happened if he had had the courage to confront Daniel and stay by Natalie's side. But now there was no time for lamenting. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and ran after his mother. The drive to Natalie's apartment was agonizing. The rain had made traffic chaotic, and every minute felt like an eternity. Patricia gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes fixed on the road. Nicholas, beside her, was breathing deeply, trying to calm the storm raging inside of him. When they finally arrived, Patricia was the first to enter the building. The apartment door was ajar. When she pushed it open, she found Natalie curled up on the bed, her eyes squeezed shut in pain, her face pale. "My God!" Patricia rushed to her, holding her sweaty hand. Nicholas stood frozen at the door, paralyzed. It was the first time he had seen Natalie since that night when he had stayed silent as she was expelled. The weight of guilt crushed him, but there was no time for that now. "We need to get her to the hospital," Patricia said. "I'll carry her," Nicholas said, finally moving toward the bed. Natalie opened her eyes for a moment and saw him. The shock was evident in her gaze. What are you doing here?" He didn't answer. He simply lifted her into his arms, feeling her body tremble against his. Minutes later in the car, Natalie was writhing in pain in the back seat. Patricia tried to keep her conscious while Nicholas drove like he had never driven before. At the hospital, nurses quickly took Natalie into the emergency room. Fear filled her eyes, but Patricia held her hand before she was wheeled away. "I'm here, my love. I'm here." The doors closed. Time seemed to freeze. Outside, Nicholas paced back and forth, his shirt soaked in sweat, his hands trembling. "What if something happens to her?" he murmured, more to himself than to his mother. Patricia looked at him sharply. "You should have thought about that before you left her alone." Nicholas closed his eyes. The truth hurt, but it was undeniable. Then the cry echoed through the hall. It was a strong, alive sound. Nicholas and Patricia exchanged a look. The relief was palpable. When the nurse appeared at the door, smiling, Patricia held her breath. "It's a boy," the nurse said, "healthy." Tears filled Patricia's eyes as she raised a hand to her mouth, emotional. Nicholas by her side seemed unable to move. Minutes later, he entered the room. Natalie was holding a small bundle in her arms, her eyes watery as she looked at the baby. When she noticed Nicholas, her expression grew serious. He's beautiful." Nicholas couldn't find the words. His throat tightened. "Natalie," his voice faltered. "I'm sorry." She turned her gaze away. "Words won't change what happened, Nicholas." He lowered his head. "I know. But I want to be part of his life. I want to be a real father." Natalie sighed. "I still don't know if I can trust you." Nicholas nodded. "Then let me prove it." Far across the city, Daniel Harrison tossed and turned in his bed. The clock read almost 3 in the morning, but sleep wouldn't come. Something was wrong. An inexplicable restlessness tightened in his chest. Without knowing why, he got up and walked to the window. The rain fell heavily, battering the dark streets. For a brief moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of foreboding. The days following Caleb's birth blurred for Natalie. Every moment was consumed by caring for the baby, who needed her attention constantly. Sleepless nights, exhaustion, and the adaptation to a new routine were challenging, but nothing compared to the overwhelming love she felt for her son. He was her reason to keep going, her strength, even after everything that had happened. Nicholas, little by little, tried to make himself present. He showed up every afternoon, carrying diapers, clothes, and even food, insisting on helping. Natalie still didn't know if she could trust him, but she also didn't have the strength to push him away. Although his presence brought painful memories, Caleb had the right to know his father. What Natalie didn't expect was that another shadow was looming over her new life. Daniel Harrison had always had absolute control over everything around him. Every employee, every investment, every decision passed through his hands. However, recently, one thing had been slipping out of his grasp: Patricia. His mother had been acting differently, more reserved, leaving frequently without explaining where she was going. In the past few days, he had seen her hurry out several times, always with the same worried expression. That particular afternoon, seeing her leave the mansion once more, he felt he could no longer ignore it. He grabbed the car keys and followed Patricia through the city, keeping a safe distance. After a few minutes of driving, he watched as she parked in front of a modest building in an area far from the luxurious zone where the Harrisons typically circulated. Daniel frowned. What was his mother doing there? He waited in the car until he saw her leave the building. Patricia was holding a bag with diapers and baby bottles, and before she got into the car, she paused for a moment, as if reflecting on something. That was enough. As soon as she left, Daniel exited the car and entered the building. The place was simple, with peeling walls and narrow hallways. A faint smell of home-cooked food lingered in the air. He walked up the stairs slowly, his curiosity growing with each step. When he reached the third floor, he saw a door slightly ajar, and before he could knock, a sound caught his attention. A baby crying. His body froze. Daniel pushed the door open carefully and stepped into the small apartment. Everything was modest but neat. Natalie wasn't in the living room. The crying came from the room at the back. He took a few steps and then stopped. In the crib, a baby was moving, his little hands waving, his face flushed from crying. For a moment, Daniel couldn't breathe. Caleb. His eyes traced every detail of that small face, and then the shock hit him like a blow. The resemblance was undeniable. The baby was identical to him when he was a child. The same shape of eyes, the same shade of hair, even the same furrowed brow, as if the child was about to challenge the world. It was like looking at a version of himself, only more fragile, more innocent. A knot tightened in his throat. He felt his hands sweat, a slight tremor running through his body. Something inside him, a sensation he couldn't name, started to grow. Before he could react, Natalie appeared in the room. She froze when she saw him there. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was filled with distrust. Daniel looked away from the baby and met her gaze. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. "My mother has been coming here. I wanted to know why." Natalie crossed her arms, as if trying to protect herself. "Now you know, so leave." But Daniel didn't move. His gaze returned to Caleb, who was now merely whimpering softly. He looks like me," he murmured, almost without realizing it. Natalie pressed her lips together, remaining firm. "And what does that change?" He didn't answer. He simply turned and left, without saying another word. In the following days, he tried to forget what he had seen. He tried to continue with his routine, drown himself in work, in business, in the world he had always known. But it was impossible. The baby's face haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those small features, so like his own. He could hear the echo of that cry trapped in his mind. Something in him had changed, and it unsettled him deeply. Why was it affecting him so much? He had never cared about children. He had never even thought about being an uncle. But now it was different. While Daniel struggled with this new reality, Nicholas, on the other hand, was determined not to waste any more time. With each passing day, he tried harder to earn Natalie's trust. He started with small visits, then long conversations. He helped with anything he could, took care of Caleb when she needed rest. He wanted to prove he had changed, and little by little, Natalie began to believe him. But the biggest surprise came from where no one expected. One afternoon, while having coffee at the mansion, Nicholas received an unexpected message. It was from Daniel. "Dinner here tomorrow. Bring Natalie and Caleb." Nicholas reread the message several times, trying to understand if it was real. Daniel had never mentioned Caleb before, and now he was inviting them for dinner. When he told Natalie, she hesitated. "Why now?" "I don't know," Nicholas admitted, "but I think we should go." She sighed, holding Caleb in her arms. "If he thinks he can humiliate me again, he's wrong." "I know, but what if it's something different?" Natalie looked at the baby, then at Nicholas. Something was changing. Daniel's invitation for dinner left Natalie uneasy. She knew he was not a man of empty gestures, and the memory of the last time she had been in that house still burned like an open wound. However, something inside her told her that she had to go. Not just for Caleb, but for herself. On the night of the dinner, Natalie wore something simple but elegant. She wanted to feel strong, even though her heart was racing. Nicholas, by her side, seemed as nervous as she was. He carried Caleb in his arms, the little one dressed in a blue romper, completely unaware of the tension surrounding the adults. When they arrived at the mansion, Patricia was the first to greet them. Her warm smile and tight hug made Natalie relax, even if only for a moment. But then Daniel appeared. He was standing at the top of the stairs, watching them with that rigid posture he always carried. His gaze was unreadable. Natalie held her chin high. She would not bow again. Without a word, Daniel descended the stairs and walked past them, heading to the dining room. The silence that followed was heavy. Patricia cleared her throat and gestured to the hallway. "Come, dinner is served." They followed down the long hallway, a path Natalie knew all too well. Every corner of that house held memories. Some were good, others painful. But none of that mattered now. The dinner began strangely. The conversation was shallow, and Daniel hardly spoke. Natalie felt his gaze on her from time to time, but he avoided looking at her directly. Then Caleb, who had been calm in Patricia's arms up until that point, began to stir. With little excited sounds, he stretched his arms toward the table, eager to explore the surroundings. Patricia laughed and placed him on the floor so he could crawl a bit. The next scene was something no one expected. Caleb, instead of crawling toward Natalie or Nicholas, turned and crawled straight toward Daniel. Everyone held their breath. The baby stopped right next to his uncle and, without hesitation, grabbed the hem of his pants, trying to steady himself to stand. Daniel looked down, stunned. Caleb, without fear, lifted his little face and smiled up at him. It was a decisive blow. For a moment, Daniel didn't know what to do. His muscles stiffened. His heart raced. He couldn't understand why that child, that tiny life who didn't even know who he was looking at him with such trust. It was a clear look, free of judgment. Before he could react, Caleb, with effort, managed to support himself on his little feet and, laughing, grabbed Daniel's finger with his tiny hand. The touch was overwhelming. A jolt ran through Daniel's body, a chill down his spine that made him hold his breath. That small hand, so fragile, held his finger as though it were a safe anchor. And for the first time, Daniel didn't pull away. He stayed there motionless, feeling the softness of Caleb's skin against his. He felt the warmth of that contact. He felt something break inside of him. Dinner continued, but Daniel barely heard the conversations. All he could think about was that moment. In the following days, he tried to forget. He buried himself in work, tried to follow his usual routine, but something inside him was different. For the first time in years, his mind was no longer consumed by numbers, business, and strategic decisions. Instead, flashes of that moment kept coming back to haunt him. Caleb's laughter, the warmth of the tiny hand gripping his finger, the smile, free of malice, free of interest, free of fear. He had never felt anything like that before, and he didn't know how to deal with it. Patricia noticed the change. She saw how Daniel had become more distracted, more restless. "What's going on with you, Daniel?" she asked one evening, watching him lost in thought. It took him a moment to respond. "I don't know." It was the first time he admitted something without having an answer. That night, alone in his office, he felt suffocated. He went to one of the cabinets and pulled out an old box full of photographs. He sifted through the images until he found one in particular, a photo of him as a baby in his father's arms. And then he realized. Caleb was identical to him. The same eyes, the same hair, the same curious expression. It was like looking at himself years ago. And at that moment, Daniel couldn't deny it any longer. He cared. Caleb wasn't just any baby. He was part of him, part of the family. In the days that followed the dinner at the mansion, something inside Daniel changed. He still tried to convince himself that nothing had happened, that his life was unchanged. But the truth was different. The face of Caleb, his innocent laugh, the warm touch of his tiny hand holding his, all of that stayed with him, haunting every thought. But even with this new restlessness, he refused to admit any feeling. Until the fear came, unexpected and overwhelming. The news arrived on an ordinary afternoon. Daniel was in his office, immersed in papers and spreadsheets, when Patricia entered without warning. "It's Caleb!" Her voice trembled, her face pale with worry. Time seemed to stop. What happened? Daniel immediately stood up, his chest tightening. "He's very sick, high fever, difficulty breathing. Natalie rushed him to the hospital." The words made the ground beneath him disappear. Caleb. Without thinking, Daniel grabbed the car keys and left. He drove through the streets with an urgency he had never felt before. The traffic seemed to crawl. Every red light was a torment. His heart beat so loudly he could hear it in his ears. He had never felt this kind of fear before. Not for money, not for business. This fear was different. When he arrived at the hospital, he found Nicholas and Natalie in the waiting room. She was sitting, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if trying to contain her pain, her eyes fixed on the emergency room door. Nicholas paced back and forth, his hair disheveled from repeatedly running his hands over his face. Daniel approached them, but for a moment he didn't know what to say. It was Nicholas who broke the silence. "He's in there with the doctors." Natalie lifted her eyes to Daniel, and there was something in them that disarmed him completely. "He's only 8 months old," she whispered. "He's so small." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. Without realizing, his fists clenched by his sides. A doctor emerged, and everyone turned to face him. "We're stabilizing the fever," the doctor said. "But the infection is severe. We'll need to wait a few more hours." The word wait had never been so cruel. Time in the hospital seemed to drag. Daniel, unable to sit still, posted himself by the window, his eyes locked on the darkness outside. And then, without realizing, he whispered something he never thought he would say. "God." The word came hesitantly, as if it were foreign to his mouth. He had never prayed before. Not when his father was dying, not when facing challenges in business. For him, faith had always been a vague concept, something weak people used to lean on. But there, that night, feeling that overwhelming despair, he found himself with no other choice. He closed his eyes. "I've never asked for anything," he whispered, feeling his chest rise and fall quickly. "But please, save this boy." And then, as if in response, the door to the room opened. The doctor appeared again. "The fever is going down. He's awake." The air returned to Daniel's lungs with a relief so intense it almost hurt. When they entered the room, they saw Caleb lying in the small hospital crib. His eyes were half open, his breathing still weak. But he was there, alive. Natalie rushed to him, holding his little hand. Nicholas stood by, gently touching the baby's forehead. Daniel, however, hesitated. Then Caleb, even weak, turned his little head in his direction and smiled. It was too much. An unfamiliar emotion hit Daniel hard. His eyes burned, his breathing became irregular. And then, unable to control himself, Daniel felt something warm slide down his face. A tear. The first in years. He quickly wiped it away, as if it was something forbidden, but deep inside, he knew the truth. He loved that boy. In the days that followed Caleb's recovery, Daniel couldn't ignore it any longer. Something inside him had changed forever. He began to visit his nephew regularly. At first, he told himself it was just to check on his recovery, but soon he found himself looking for excuses to go to Natalie's apartment. Patricia noticed the change. "You don't need to make up reasons, Daniel," she said one afternoon, watching him adjust the collar of his shirt before leaving. He looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" She smiled faintly. "You want to see Caleb. Just admit it." Daniel remained silent. But as he left, he realized his mother was right. That day, when he picked up Caleb and saw him laugh, he knew that for the first time in his life, he had found something more valuable than money. Since Caleb's hospitalization, Daniel had become a different man. His routine was no longer defined solely by endless meetings and multi-million-dollar deals. Now, there was a new habit that, to his surprise, he looked forward to: visiting Caleb. Ever since the nephew had first uttered the word uncle, something inside him had broken irreversibly. For the first time, Daniel felt he belonged to something that couldn't be bought, negotiated, or controlled. And though he still hesitated to admit it, that feeling made him feel good. But the change didn't go unnoticed by those around him. That night, while dining at a sophisticated restaurant in the city center, Daniel encountered someone from his past. "I can't believe it," a feminine voice came from behind him. He turned around and found Natalia, an ex-girlfriend from years ago. Beautiful, elegant, and always calculating, she still carried that air of superiority that used to irritate him and yet amuse him in the past. "Natalia," he greeted her with a slight nod of his head. She sat at his table without being invited, a sly smile on her lips. "I heard you've been quite busy lately, but surprisingly not with business." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, Daniel." She fiddled with her wine glass. "Everyone is talking about how the powerful Harrison seems to be enchanted by a baby." He fell silent, his jaw clenching. Natalia laughed. "I never imagined you would become that type of man. The Daniel I knew would never waste time on something so sentimental." There was poison in those words, an implicit challenge. "I don't waste time, Natalia." His voice came out firm, but something inside him wavered. She noticed. "Are you sure? Because from what I hear, you spend hours with that child. Do you know what that looks like? Weakness." The word froze his blood. Weakness. Suddenly he wasn't there, in that restaurant. He was back in his childhood, sitting in his father's office, hearing George Harrison's harsh voice echo in the air. Weakness has no place in a Harrison. Emotions are a distraction. You need to be stronger than others to stay on top. His father's words came back with force, like a whip cutting through his mind. Was he making a mistake? Was he becoming a weak man? In the days that followed, that thought consumed him, and without realizing it, he began to pull away. On the first day, he ignored the message from Nicholas asking if he was going to visit Caleb. On the second, he rejected Patricia's phone call. On the third, when he was about to leave the office to go to Natalie's house, he simply changed his mind. Staying away was the best decision. He convinced himself that Caleb didn't need him, that the feeling was just a passing illusion. But then Patricia noticed. One night, without warning, she entered his office. "What are you doing?" she asked, crossing her arms. Daniel didn't raise his eyes from the papers in front of him. "Working." "Don't lie to me." Her voice was cold. "You're running away." He sighed heavily. "I don't have time for this, Mom." "No?" Patricia tilted her head. "You have all the time in the world for business. But for your nephew who almost died in the hospital a few weeks ago, you don't?" He gritted his teeth. "I'm not his father." "No, you're not. But do you know what you are? A coward." Daniel finally looked up. Patricia had never called him that before. "You're running away, Daniel. You're afraid of what you feel, because for the first time in your life, you can't control something." He remained silent. "You're repeating your father's mistakes," she continued. "You're depriving yourself of love because you think it will make you stronger. But do you know what really makes a man weak? The fear of feeling." Those words haunted him for the rest of the night. He tried to ignore them. He tried to drown the discomfort in work, in expensive whiskey, in the silence of his room. But the next morning, when he picked up his phone, he saw a message from Nicholas. It was a photo. Caleb, dressed in a small black suit, identical to the ones Daniel used to wear. The baby was holding a toy briefcase and looking at the camera with a curious smile. The caption simply read, "I think he wants to be like his uncle." Daniel stared at the image for a long time, and then, finally, he understood. It didn't matter what Natalia or his father said. It didn't matter if the world called him weak. Caleb saw him as an example. And for the first time, Daniel knew he couldn't run anymore. In the last few months, Daniel Harrison had become a different man. His routine was no longer defined solely by endless meetings and multi-million-dollar contracts. Now, there was a new habit that, to his own surprise, he looked forward to: visits to Caleb. Since the day his nephew had uttered the word uncle for the first time, something inside Daniel had irreversibly broken. For the first time, Daniel felt like he belonged to something that couldn't be bought, negotiated, or controlled. And though he still hesitated to admit it, this feeling brought him a kind of peace. But the change didn't go unnoticed by those around him. One evening, as Daniel sat at a luxurious restaurant in the heart of the city, enjoying a glass of wine, he encountered someone from his past. "I don't believe it," a voice came from behind him. He turned and came face to face with Natalia, an ex-girlfriend from years ago. She was still as beautiful and calculating as ever, with that same air of superiority that used to both irritate and amuse him. "Natalia." He greeted her with a slight nod of his head. She sat down at his table uninvited, a sly smile on her lips. "I heard you've been very busy lately, but surprisingly not with business." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Oh, Daniel." She twirled her wine glass. "Everyone's talking about how the powerful Harrison seems to be enchanted by a baby." He fell silent, clenching his jaw. Natalia laughed. "I never imagined you would become that kind of man. The Daniel I knew would never waste time on something so sentimental." The words were venomous, an implicit challenge. I don't waste time, Natalia. His voice came out firm, but something inside him wavered. She noticed. Are you sure? Because from what I hear, you spend hours with that child. Do you know what that looks like? Weakness. The word hit him like a slap. Weakness. Suddenly, he wasn't sitting there at that restaurant. He was back in his childhood, sitting in his father's office, hearing George Harrison's harsh voice echo in the room. Weakness has no place in a Harrison. Emotions are a distraction. You need to be stronger than others to stay at the top. His father's words flooded his mind with brutal force. Was he making a mistake? Was he becoming a weak man? In the days that followed, that thought consumed him, and without realizing it, he began to withdraw. On the first day, he ignored the message from Nicholas asking if he would visit Caleb. On the second, he rejected Patricia's phone call. On the third, when he was about to leave his office to go to Natalie's house, he simply changed his mind. Staying away was the best decision. He convinced himself that Caleb didn't need him, that this feeling was just a passing illusion. But then Patricia noticed. One night, without warning, she entered his office. "What are you doing?" she asked, crossing her arms. Daniel didn't look up from the papers in front of him. "Working." "Don't lie to me." Her voice was cold. "You're running away." He sighed heavily. "I don't have time for this, Mom." "No?" Patricia tilted her head. "For business, you have all the time in the world. But for your nephew, who almost died in the hospital a few weeks ago, you don't." He clenched his teeth. "I'm not his father." "No, you're not. But do you know what you are? A coward." Daniel finally looked up. Patricia had never called him that before. "You're running away, Daniel. You're afraid of what you feel, because for the first time in your life you can't control something." He stayed silent. "You're repeating your father's mistakes," she continued. "You're depriving yourself of love because you think it will make you stronger. But do you know what really makes a man weak? The fear of feeling." Those words haunted him for the rest of the night. He tried to ignore them. He tried to drown his discomfort in work, in expensive whiskey, in the silence of his room. But the next morning, when he picked up his phone, he saw a message from Nicholas. It was a photo. Caleb, dressed in a small black suit, identical to the ones Daniel used to wear. The baby was holding a toy briefcase and looking at the camera with a curious smile. The caption simply read, "I think he wants to be like his uncle." Daniel stared at the image for a long time, and then finally he understood. It didn't matter what Natalia or his father said. It didn't matter if the world called him weak. Caleb saw him as an example, and for the first time, Daniel knew he couldn't run anymore. The weight of the decision had been inside Daniel for days. Since he saw the photo of Caleb dressed like him, since he realized he had been running from something inevitable, since he felt that tightness in his chest that only grew. He tried to resist, tried to ignore it, but the truth relentlessly pursued him. That night, alone in his office, holding an untouched glass of whiskey, he felt that there was no more choice. Before he could hesitate, he grabbed the car keys and left. The streets were nearly empty, lit only by the streetlights scattered along the avenue. Daniel drove without music, without distractions, only with thoughts pounding in his mind. When he realized it, he was already parked in front of Natalie's building. He took a deep breath, got out of the car, and climbed the stairs. With every step, he felt his heart beat stronger. When he reached the door, he didn't think. He just knocked. A few seconds later, he heard footsteps. The door opened, revealing Natalie with a sleepy face and a confused expression. "Daniel," her voice came out hesitantly. He stared at her, eyes firm without looking away. "I came to see Caleb." The silence between them lasted for long seconds. Natalie seemed to measure her words, trying to understand what this meant. Then, without a word, she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The apartment was dim, lit only by a weak light coming from the hallway. The environment was simple, but welcoming. Caleb was sleeping deeply in the crib, his breathing light and peaceful. Daniel slowly approached, observing him. The last time he had seen him, he was in that photo, dressed like him, smiling at the camera. Now there, he seemed so small, so vulnerable. "He misses you." Natalie broke the silence, her voice low but firm. Daniel shifted his gaze from the baby and met hers. "I miss him too." The words came out before he could control them. For a moment, Natalie seemed surprised. But she didn't answer, only watched as he pulled out a chair and sat next to the crib. It was the first night of many. In the following days, Daniel began to appear more frequently. At first, he stayed only a few minutes, watching Caleb, exchanging a few words with Natalie. But over time, the minutes turned into hours. For the first time, he allowed himself to lower his guard. One day, while Caleb was playing on the carpet in the living room, Daniel, almost without realizing it, sat on the floor beside him. The baby, excited, extended a toy to him, waiting for him to participate. Daniel hesitated. He had never played with a child before. He never knew how to act in a moment like that, but seeing the expectant look on Caleb's face, he took the toy and awkwardly joined in the play. Natalie watched from the kitchen, saying nothing. There was something strange in that scene, something she never imagined she would see. Daniel Harrison, the most rigid man she had ever known, sitting on the floor holding a colorful toy and laughing softly. And so, a new routine was established. Daniel no longer needed excuses to show up. He just came. Over time, his presence became natural. When the doorbell rang, Caleb would immediately crawl toward the door, smiling, as if he knew it was his uncle. And Daniel, who once saw himself as a stranger in that child's life, began to realize that he was becoming a part of it. Until the unexpected request came. One afternoon, while having coffee in the living room, Nicholas and Natalie exchanged glances before turning to Daniel. "We want to ask you something," Nicholas began, his voice full of meaning. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What?" Natalie took a deep breath. "We're getting married." He nodded, unsurprised. "That's good." Nicholas smiled, but soon became serious again. "We want you to be Caleb's godfather." The silence filled the room. Daniel looked at them, unsure if he had heard correctly. "What?" "You're part of his life," Natalie explained. "It doesn't matter what happened in the past. What matters is who you are to him now." Those words hit him in a way he didn't expect. For a moment, he thought about refusing, but looking at Caleb, who was playing on the carpet without understanding the importance of the moment, he knew the answer. "I accept." The relief on Nicholas and Natalie's faces was obvious. But there was something Daniel hadn't done yet. Something that, no matter how much he tried to avoid, he knew had to happen. He looked at Natalie. "I never—" His voice faltered. He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I never apologized." She grew serious. He continued, "I was cruel. I kicked you out mercilessly without even trying to understand. I can't change what I did, but I can say that I regret it." The silence between them was long. Finally, Natalie looked away. "You were cruel." The confirmation hurt more than Daniel expected. "But," she looked back at him, "the man you were that night is not the man standing here now." There was weight in those words, and in that moment, Daniel knew that the last barrier was about to fall. The last barrier between Daniel and Natalie had been broken down. He had finally admitted his mistakes, recognized his cruelty, and more importantly, shown that he was willing to change. But there was still something missing, something that, even without realizing it, needed to happen. The final proof that Natalie was no longer a secret. That week, Daniel organized a grand charity event in the name of the Harrisons. It would be a luxurious night filled with businessmen, politicians, and influential socialites. The goal was to raise funds for charitable institutions, but above all, to reaffirm the family's position in the social scene. It was Patricia who insisted that Natalie be invited. "She is part of our family now," Patricia said, leaving no room for discussion. Daniel agreed without hesitation. But when Natalie received the invitation, she felt conflicted. "I don't know if I want to go," she confessed to Nicholas while packing Caleb's things. "Why not?" She sighed, looking around the small apartment where they lived. "Because I don't belong to this world." Nicholas took her hand. "You belong to our family. That's what matters." On the day of the event, Natalie arrived at the Grand Hall accompanied by Nicholas. The place was breathtaking. Enormous chandeliers illuminated the room. The marble floor gleamed under the guests' heels, and waiters discreetly moved between tables adorned with expensive floral arrangements. But as soon as Natalie stepped inside, she felt out of place. The stares that assessed her from head to toe were impossible to ignore. She recognized some of the women who frequented the same social circles as Daniel. Always immaculate, always haughty, always ready to judge. And then came Ashley Brown. Ashley was a well-known socialite, arrogant and always looking for Daniel's attention. She'd always orbited the Harrison family, using her beauty and status to try and get close to Daniel. "But what do we have here?" she said with a venomous smile as she approached Natalie. The conversations around them quieted. People began to discreetly watch them. "You must be lost, dear," Ashley continued, her eyes scanning the simple dress Natalie was wearing. Natalie stood firm, refusing to answer. "Funny," Ashley laughed, grabbing a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "A few months ago, I heard that Daniel Harrison threw a maid out of the mansion, and now this same woman is here, acting as if she were one of us." Natalie felt her blood boil. "What are you implying?" she asked, her voice firm. "I'm just stating the obvious." Ashley took another sip of her drink. "No matter what happens, you'll never be a Harrison." The comment sparked quiet laughter from some of the other guests, but before Natalie could respond, a firm voice cut through the room. "Natalie is the mother of my nephew. Show her respect." The entire hall fell silent. Ashley paled. Everyone turned to look at Daniel, who was now standing beside Natalie, his expression as cold as ever. The tension in the room was palpable. "Daniel, dear." Ashley tried to soften her tone, but he didn't give her a chance. "I said," he repeated, his voice laced with authority, "show her respect." There was no room for argument in his tone, no space for questioning. This was the first time Daniel had publicly defended her, the first time he had made it clear in front of the entire high society that Natalie was not just a shadow from the past. She was part of the Harrison family. Ashley, with no choice, shot one last look of hatred at Natalie and walked away. Natalie, still surprised, looked at Daniel. "You didn't have to do that." He looked at her seriously. "Yes, I did." She saw the truth in his eyes, and for the first time she felt that maybe she wasn't so alone in this battle anymore. Later, when the event was over, Daniel found her alone on the terrace, gazing out at the illuminated city. He walked up to her slowly. "Can I join you?" She nodded. For a moment, they stood in silence. Then Daniel spoke. "I was cruel." Natalie blinked, surprised. He continued, "I kicked you out without mercy. I humiliated you. I was arrogant and insensitive." She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Yes, you were." Daniel took a deep breath. "I regret it." Those words carried immense weight. Natalie turned to face him. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes that had never been there before. Vulnerability. She could have stayed resentful. She could have thrown in his face everything he had done to her. But she didn't. Because in that moment, she understood. The man standing in front of her wasn't the same man who had thrown her out. And then, with tears in her eyes, she responded, I forgive you, Daniel. He looked at her, surprised. She smiled faintly. But not because you deserve it, and because now I know your heart finally beats for real. The charity event had marked a turning point in Daniel's life. For the first time, he had publicly taken a stand beside Natalie, making it clear to everyone that she and Caleb were part of the Harrison family. But as much as he was changing, he still didn't fully understand the depth of that bond. Until the day, everything almost fell apart. The afternoon sun streamed gently through the curtains of the room as Natalie folded some clothes on the sofa. Caleb played just a few feet away from her, laughing, enchanted by a wooden car that Nicholas had given him. He was starting to walk, and every step was still uncertain, wobbly, but full of excitement. It only took a second, a stumble, a sharp thud against the floor. Silence. Natalie turned instantly, her heart already racing, and felt the world crumble as she saw Caleb lying motionless on the ground. "Caleb!" She ran over, scooping him up into her arms. His little body was limp, his tiny head pale, his eyes closed. My God, wake up, baby!" But he didn't move. Panic took over. Her hands trembled as she searched for her phone. Her fingers slipped on the screen from how much she was sweating. When she finally managed to dial, her voice was broken. "Nicholas, it's Caleb. He fell. He won't wake up." On the other end of the line, Nicholas didn't hesitate. "I'm coming!" Minutes later, he arrived at full speed. Natalie was already waiting for him at the door, holding Caleb against her chest, her eyes swollen with tears, her sobs choked by the urgency of the moment. Nicholas didn't say a word. He just helped her into the car and drove off down the streets. The ride to the hospital was a nightmare. Natalie cried, clutching Caleb's small body against her. "He'll be fine, he'll be fine," Nicholas repeated, more to himself than to her. But the truth was, fear consumed him. At the hospital, nurses rushed in as soon as they saw them. One of the nurses took Caleb from their arms and disappeared with him down the hall. "Please, save my baby," Natalie begged, but there was no one there to answer. At the Harrison mansion, Patricia had just served herself some tea when the phone rang. When she answered, she felt the blood freeze in her veins. It took no time at all for her to grab her bag and rush to the car. But before she left, she called Daniel. He answered with his usual calm voice, unaware of what was coming. "Mom? It's Caleb." 2 words were enough to make his world come crashing down. "What happened?" "He had a fall. He's unconscious at the hospital." The phone almost slipped from his hands. For a moment, Daniel couldn't react. His chest felt tight, his breath shallow. And then, without thinking, he grabbed the car keys and left. He drove like a madman, ignoring red lights, cutting through streets, speeding as if his own life depended on it. He had never felt this kind of fear before. When he arrived at the hospital, he found Natalie sitting in one of the waiting room chairs, her face buried in her hands. Nicholas stood beside her, pale, unsure of what to say. Patricia was standing, her eyes brimming with tears, trying to hold on to her composure. Upon seeing them, Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He had never felt so powerless. It was then that he did something he never imagined he would do. He walked to a corner of the waiting room, away from the others, and knelt. He closed his eyes. "God," he whispered, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. "I've never asked for anything. I never believed I needed you." He swallowed hard, his breath heavy. "But please, save Caleb." The words came out raw, genuine. He didn't want money, he didn't want power, he didn't want more business. He just wanted that little boy to live. He didn't know how much time passed in that corner. He only realized when he heard a sound, a cry. His heart skipped a beat. He lifted his head and saw the nurse reappearing from the hallway with a soft smile on her face. He woke up. Natalie and Nicholas rushed inside the room. Patricia pressed her hand to her chest, relieved. But Daniel remained still for a few seconds. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and then, for the first time since childhood, he felt something warm slide down his face. A tear. Inside the room, Natalie held Caleb with all the love in the world. The baby was still weak, but he slowly opened his eyes and, seeing his mother, gave her a faint smile. Nicholas discreetly wiped his eyes, letting out a sigh of relief. It was then that Daniel entered. Caleb turned his little head and saw him. A bigger smile spread across his face, and it was there, in that moment, that Daniel knew. He knew that this child was his redemption. He slowly approached, touched Caleb's tiny hand, and felt his little fingers close around his own. The tightness in his chest was replaced by something new, something real. He leaned down and whispered, "I will never leave you again." This time, he knew he was telling the truth. The fear of loss had changed Daniel forever. After Caleb's accident, he understood that he couldn't deny what he felt anymore, that the little boy was the most important thing in his life. It no longer mattered what his father would have thought, what others would say, or if it made him a different man than he had always been. He would no longer run. That's how, a few weeks later, he found himself at Nicholas and Natalie's wedding, holding Caleb's little hand as they walked down the open-air aisle. The ceremony took place in a wide garden, surrounded by old trees and delicate flowers scattered across the lawn. The altar, decorated with fluttering white fabrics and soft lights, seemed like something out of a dream. Daniel, dressed in an impeccable suit, walked with determination, but unlike any other social event he had attended before, he didn't care about the grandeur of the occasion. He looked beside him and saw Caleb, small in his little navy blue suit, walking with small but determined steps. His little hand tightly held Daniel's with confidence. And it was at that moment that Daniel realized this was the most important moment of his life. As they walked, all eyes were on Natalie, who entered from the other side of the garden. Her dress was simple yet elegant, and her eyes sparkled with genuine happiness. Patricia smiled, emotional, and Nicholas, standing at the altar, seemed to hold his breath when he saw her approach. But it was Caleb who stole the show. When he spotted Patricia among the guests, he let go of Daniel's hand and crawled toward her, babbling something excitedly. Patricia laughed, bending down to pick him up in her arms. And it was there, in that simple, natural scene, that Daniel realized he was complete. It wasn't just Natalie and Nicholas getting married. It wasn't just another event for high society. It was a new family being formed, and he was part of it. The ceremony proceeded beautifully and emotionally. Nicholas and Natalie exchanged meaningful vows, promising love and respect, and when the "I do" was said, the sound of applause blended with the soft afternoon breeze. After the ceremony, the celebration began. The atmosphere was light, filled with laughter and genuine happiness. Caleb moved between the guests, being spoiled by everyone, especially Patricia, who held him as if she never intended to let him go. It was then that Nicholas, with a glass of champagne in hand, drew everyone's attention. "I want to say a few words." The guests gathered, awaiting the toast. Natalie moved closer to her husband, holding her glass. "Today is a special day for us," Nicholas began. "And not just because we are getting married, but because, after so many difficulties, we are here together." He looked at Daniel, a sincere smile on his lips. "And also because we've learned that family is made up of those we choose to have by our side." Daniel didn't look away. There was so much meaning in those words. It was then that, without thinking, Daniel bent down and picked up Caleb in his arms. The little boy looked up at him with shining eyes, just as he always did when he saw his uncle. And in front of everyone, Daniel finally said the words he had never had the courage to say before. I love you." The brief silence that followed was intense. Caleb smiled, as if he had known that all along. Nicholas and Natalie exchanged emotional glances. Patricia smiled, content, and Daniel knew that he had never spoken such a true thing in his life. After that day, everything changed. He began to care less about numbers, contracts, and business. His time was now divided between the company and afternoons with Caleb. With every visit, he realized that his true wealth wasn't in the millions he had accumulated, but in the small hand that always held his whenever he arrived. And little by little, the cold, calculating man gave way to a loving, present uncle. The millionaire who had never known love now knew that his purpose had always been in the eyes of a little boy named Caleb.